Okay, I just said that I was going to give people 2 minutes, but I lied. We only have an hour and we have a lot to cover. So we are just going to get started. Thank you all so much for being here today. Sorry about my computer sounds. My name is Hannah Riley, and I'm the Director of Programming at the Center for Just Journalism. And I am very happy to be joined today by these four brilliant folks who are going to talk about something that is feeling, unfortunately, very timely, and that's the criminalization of immigration. Um, Let me start by saying the criminalization of immigration is not new. The collaboration between local policing and immigration enforcement has been happening for a long time. Didn't start under Trump, and it's also not going to end with Trump. Um, so we're going to talk today a little bit about the history of local police and the role that they play in criminalizing immigrants, whether that's programs like 287G or secure communities, both of which we'll get into a bit later, or just the everyday practices of policing that disproportionately target these communities. So Trump is absolutely ramping these efforts up, but the machinery of deportation and detention and surveillance has relied on local law enforcement as a key partner for a long time. Um, an important part of our discussion today, obviously, is the role that journalism plays in helping people understand these issues. The way that we report on immigration and also policing directly influences how people perceive their safety around these issues, sort of whether they think of immigrants as neighbors and community members or threats. And for years, I think we've seen immigration framed as a public safety issue, sort of broadly, instead of the offshoots of it, the impacts, someone avoiding going to the hospital because of fear of arrest or keeping their kids home from school, things that do directly impact safety and wellness. I think this is a difficult time to be reporting on this. There's a really fine line to walk between accurate reporting and sensationalizing. We know that one, inflammatory headline can maybe give undue weight to a policy that might make it seem inevitable when in fact, like it can't be fully implemented. So I think there's a real need to be careful about not amplifying just fear and lending credibility to policies that are maybe more political theater than reality, while also acknowledging the very, very real harms and threats that are facing these communities today and that they have been facing for quite a long time. So I hope that today's conversation helps folks understand, get a better sense of what's actually happening on the ground, what's likely to change versus what is just rhetoric, how these shifts compare to past policies, and what strategies we can use to challenge official narratives, find the impact, and report on this with accuracy and with depth. So we're going to be hearing from these very smart people who have been working on and tracking these issues long before this administration, who can help us sort of understand the history as well as the stakes, I think, of this moment. And we're hoping that this is just going to be conversational. You should have access to the little Q&A thing. Feel free to put questions in whenever. If it sort of feels relevant to what we're talking about in the moment, I'll ask it then. And if not, we'll save some time at the end for questions. So yeah, without any further ado, I'm just going to ask the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, maybe going Tanya, Scott, Amrutha, Lena. All right, Tanya.
Right on. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about the conversation. My name is Reverend Tanya Lozano Washington. I'm stationed here in Chicago, Illinois. I'm the pastor of Holy Ground Lincoln United Methodist Church. I'm also one of the chair people and founder of Healthyhood Chicago and the lead Chicago organizer for Zealous. Lots of different positions. Healthyhood is an organization that takes a social justice approach to health and wellness. It's also kind of like a baby organization of my mother's organization, which is Centro Sin Fronteras, also known as Familia Latina Unida. My father, Reverend Slim Coleman, and my mother, Pastor Emma Lozano, were the pastors who opened up their church in early 2000s to give sanctuary to Elvira Arellano. When she was faced with her deportation, she was a single mother of a U.S. citizen child. It became international news, and it reignited what we call the new sanctuary movement here in Chicago. Even though our city has been a sanctuary city for over 40 years, it just kind of brought it back into like the headlines. And so yeah, big long history of being like a struggle kid is what I call myself, what me and my siblings call ourselves, born into the movement, specifically around the issue of immigration, and have expanded into just taking a comprehensive approach to all of the needs of our marginalized communities, as most of our undocumented population is a part of mixed status families. And so they're more complex, I think, than most people think, and need a lot more than just immigration services. So that's kind of what our organization has become. So I'll leave it there. I'll pass it to you, Scott.
Great. Thanks so much. I'm Scott Levy. I am Chief Policy Counsel at Forward.us. For folks who don't know Forward is a bipartisan organization that works on immigration and criminal justice issues, and I work on both of those issues at Forward. Prior to coming to Forward, I was a longtime public defender in New York, and did a lot of policy, criminal justice, and immigration policy work in New York. And so I'm excited for this conversation. Pass it along.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amrutha Jindal, and I am the Executive Director of Lone Star Defender's Office. Lone Star Defender's Office is the organization that provides criminal defense representation to individuals arrested under Operation Lone Star, which you may know is Governor Greg Abbott's border security initiative that started in 2021. So my office is responsible for providing attorneys to the individuals who are arrested under that program and representing them in their state criminal cases. Prior to starting and being the ED of Lone Star Defender's Office, I spent about 7 years as a federal public defender in San Diego, handling a lot of criminal cases that intersect with the area of immigration, like federal illegal entry and reentry cases. And I'm based in Houston. I'll pass it to Lena.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. I'm glad to join you all. My name is Lena Graber. I'm a senior staff attorney at the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. We are a national nonprofit resource center that provides expertise on immigration law and policy. We do policy advocacy work around the country, but particularly in California and Texas, and as well as DC. And kind of run the gamut of immigration legal issues and trainings and capacity building for immigrant communities and immigrant legal services providers. My expertise is particularly around the machinery of immigration enforcement and how detention and deportations happen, and particularly the role of local law enforcement in those operations. We have been tracking and helping write sanctuary policies across the country for the last 10 or 15 years, and maintain a lot of expertise on all the different ways that local law enforcement are involved in immigration enforcement, whether or not they are even paying attention. So I'll be glad to talk more about that.
Thank you all. Let's do that, Lena. This is kind of a big two-parter question. Can you sort of set the stage for us talking about what you just mentioned, the role of local law enforcement in immigration enforcement sort of over the last 30-ish years? How have we gotten to this point?
Sure. So I think the important starting point with local police and local sheriffs with immigration is that around 70% of people that are ICE arrests in the interior of the country, so not in border operations, but around the United States, people living in the US, around 70 to 75% of the people they arrested are handed directly to them from some other law enforcement agency, mostly sheriffs, some local police, some state prisons, some state troopers, some other law enforcement agency, some federal law enforcement. And so the local police being on the ground all across our country and making arrests are absolutely the engine of immigration enforcement and deportations around the country. This started since the creation of DHS. DHS has really intentionally made this their strategy for how to do immigration enforcement. And in over time, but around 2008, 2012, they created the Secure Communities Program. And under this Secure Communities Program, every single person that is arrested anywhere in the country and booked into jail has their fingerprints sent and checked against immigration databases. And so that is the first step in a process. And it starts at the very beginning when they are arrested, regardless of the charge in that arrest, regardless of whether it was a pretextual arrest purely for the purpose of initiating immigration proceedings. One of the things that that program has taught law enforcement around the country is that they can potentially begin a deportation process just by bringing someone into custody, regardless of how that happened. So local police are really determining the majority of people who go into deportation proceedings. And then what happens after that depends on a lot of things, including the federal government's prerogatives and priorities, and the law and the person's individual legal case. But kind of who comes in at the get-go is driven by our criminal legal system and the choices that they are making in policing. So sanctuary policies push back on this by a locality enacting a rule saying, okay, we don't want to be the dragnet of immigration enforcement, and we're not going to spend local resources helping ICE deport our residents. And I think there's lots to say about sanctuary policies. A big one is that they work because local police are the dragnet of immigration enforcement. When we say, no, we're not going to do that, that has an impact. And that's part of why the Trump administration is so viciously targeting sanctuary policies and did in the first Trump administration, was to attack and try to coerce those jurisdictions back into being the lapdogs of ICE. The last thing that I think is an important piece of this picture is that the federal government has a whole bunch of different detention facilities, but in immigration, even though it's supposedly civil law and it's just about do you stay or go in this country, it operates a massive detention program, as we know. And a lot of this is built also on the capacities and the facilities of local law enforcement, county jails. Over time, this has shifted a little bit because the private prison industry has gotten so big into renting their facilities for ICE that a much bigger proportion of immigration detention is now run by private prisons. But even so, ICE absolutely depends on the detention capacity to imprison people facing deportation of sheriffs and jails around the country. And that's another complicated tangle of how those custody transfers happen, and what are the incentives involved. So I'll stop there and we can get more into the weeds if we need.
Thank you so much. Now, as a follow-up, and Scott, if you want to jump in on this too, feel free. What changes has this new administration proposed and potentially already enacted when it comes to these things?
Lena, I'm happy to kick it to you and then I can follow up.
It's a very long list, especially in the proposed camp. I think, for one thing, they've obviously made all kinds of threats, and in the wash of executive orders that happened over the last 2 months, all kinds of initial steps to strip federal funding from jurisdictions that aren't turning their local law enforcement agencies over to immigration enforcement. So defunding federal grants from sanctuary cities, Another really big piece is all of the threats from the Department of Justice to prosecute or investigate or otherwise try to pursue some kind of criminal case against either immigrants themselves for all kinds of different minor violations, or for people who advocate or try to defend immigrant rights in various ways, including sanctuary policies, but much broader than that. I think there is a really aggressive criminalization of opposition that is going on at the Trump administration, where with the climate of fear that anything you do that is contrary to the political ends of the Trump administration will subject you to not only demonization and threats, but potentially criminal prosecutions and sort of the pressure from the federal government. So that's just two things I will list, but Scott, please add.
I was going to take a quick step back and then can maybe bring us to the Laken Riley. But in addition to everything that Lena has laid out, there's also been a real convergence and merger of federal immigration law and state criminal law, right? Really starting in the mid-90s, you see federal immigration legislation increasingly making criminal justice contact and really state criminal justice contact as the sort of driving, motivating factor in immigration enforcement law, right? So you see state level convictions being made, grounds of inadmissibility, removability, and you see that sort of bucket expand. Really, some of this had existed pre-90s, but in the 90s, you see a huge expansion, and you see that continue to expand. And so that really laid the groundwork for what this sort of deep interaction between federal immigration enforcement and state level criminal justice operations. So that, is happening in the 90s. And I will point out that, I grew up as a lawyer in New York, right? During the time of stop and frisk, quality of life policing, broken windows policing, when you see a policing strategy being rolled out across the country that reaches sort of deeper and deeper into low level offenses, bringing many more people into contact with the criminal justice system. In 2011 alone, right, there were 685,000 people stopped and frisked on the streets of New York, 51,000 people arrested for marijuana possession, right? Marijuana possession, I always just, mention that because in New York at the time, a non-criminal, not even a misdemeanor marijuana violation could lead to inadmissibility or removability for a green card holder, somebody who is a legal permanent resident. So you had this sort of expansion of policing and criminalization on the criminal justice side, mirroring an expansion of criminalization within immigration law, right? Such that by the time Secure Communities is coming out, you also see the Supreme Court hand down Padilla versus Kentucky, which really for the first time acknowledges this deeply entangled these deeply entangled systems, and says that, criminal defense attorneys have an obligation to advise their clients on the immigration consequences of their pleas, right? And that is an admission of this sort of deep entanglement that we see. And that sort of the legal underpinning of all of this is sort of what also gives rise and sort of the impetus for everything that Lena has sort of laid out, right? The deep reliance on state, local law enforcement to enact and to sort of execute immigration enforcement. And so that's sort of, I think that logic, both on the sort of the policy and implementation side and also on the law and statutory side, right? It comes really into, I think, sharp focus with the Laken Riley Act, which, and I know, Lena, you may want to talk about this as well, may not actually change detention policy that much, right? Folks who are being picked up by ICE could already be detained and are, as Lena's already mentioned, right? Most folks who are ending up in ICE detention or in ICE custody are ending up there because of contact with criminal justice system. But what you see is even at the statutory level, right, at federal statute, right, you see federal immigration law digging deeper and deeper and deeper into state criminal justice policy, such that, right, we now know that it requires mandatory detention for anybody who's even accused of a theft-related offense, right? And I think that's one really important point, and we'll talk about sort of like the coverage of these issues later. But right, what that means though is that federal law is saying we're going to specifically single people out who have not even necessarily even been charged, much less convicted of offenses. So like Laken Riley right, requires mandatory detention for folks who've been accused of a variety of different offenses, many of which are low-level, non-felony offenses across the country, right? And so you see the sort of continued merger of these things, and you see federal law, policy, and enforcement digging deeper and deeper and deeper into the everyday interactions between police and people in their communities for very low-level types of interactions, right? And so, yeah, I'll pause there, but I think Laken Riley really kind of brings these two threads together in a really important and destructive way.
Thank you both so much. Amrutha, I'm going to go to you. You mentioned Operation Lone Star in your introduction. Texas already had very harsh enforcement policies. Can you talk a little bit about what Operation Lone Star is and sort of what's happening on the ground? Have you seen a change over the past couple of months? And then I'm also curious if you feel like the media coverage that you've seen either in Texas or nationally is capturing what you're seeing in your office every day.
Sure. So as I mentioned, Operation Lone Star is Governor Greg Abbott's essentially the state of Texas's attempt to police immigration, which is typically handled by the federal government. It was launched in 2021, and it was an entirely new criminal justice system that essentially formed in response to this new border security initiative. So everything from how people are detained, where they're detained, how courts operate is a brand new system under Operation Lone Star. And that in and of itself is a pretty scary thing. The fact that pretty quickly the state was able to set up an entirely new criminal legal system just for mostly for immigrants and people who are being accused of border-related crimes. I'll just quickly kind of go over some of the things that Texas did for under OLS. So the first thing is that they set up temporary processing centers where people who are arrested get booked and magistrated. So these are basically large tent facilities. Rather than having your initial court hearing at the local county courthouse, you're driven hours to these tent facilities. From there, you are transferred to a prison unit that has been converted into a pretrial detention facility just for Operation Lone Star. So unlike most criminal defendants who are held in detention facilities in the local county, at the local county jail, for mostly the immigrants that are being arrested under Operation Lone Star, they are being transferred hours away to prisons that are post-conviction units that have been repurposed just for Operation Lone Star clients. Court hearings predominantly occur over Zoom. So you have thousands of people that have been accused and ultimately many have been convicted of criminal offenses that have never stepped foot into an actual courtroom. All of their hearings are occurring from jail. So the fact that Texas was able to set this up, as well as find the resources, the funding, and the logistics for all of the hours and hours of transportation to get people from all these different locations. Texas is such a big state, is quite alarming, but also serves in many ways as the blueprint for what we're starting to see the federal government roll out now under the Trump administration. In the course of I guess now 4 years or so that Operation Lone Star has been around, my office has helped coordinate the representation for over 17,000 individuals. The majority of those individuals were charged with misdemeanor trespass, which essentially means that they were found on a private property. Usually, in that part of the border, there are a lot of large ranches. So they were found on a ranch without permission of the landowner. That's the basic elements of the charge. What we hear on the ground is that most of our clients were asylum seekers who are trying to turn themselves into immigration. So they see the large law enforcement presence at the Texas-Mexico border because of Operation Lone Star. They see people in camo they assume are ICE or federal government officials. And so they're crossing in these areas to surrender because they want to apply for asylum. In many instances, they're directed onto the property by law enforcement, thinking, and our clients think that's how they go to turn themselves to immigration, only to then be arrested for trespassing. The other smaller percentage of cases that we handle are for the felony charge of smuggling of persons. The majority of the clients charged with smuggling of persons are U.S. citizens, and they're essentially being charged for driving undocumented immigrants from point A to point B. They're not crossing the border. Most of our cases do not involve people hidden in secret compartments or anything like that. They're just driving them in their car. And as I mentioned, they're not only are our clients U.S. citizens, but they're also very young. They're being recruited through social media and other kind of channels similar to that to get a little bit of money in exchange for driving people. As far as changes in the recent months go, we have seen just a really steep decline of prosecutions of arrests in the last, I'd say, like year, and certainly really, really low numbers in the last few months. Even before the Trump administration went into office, we've seen a decline in numbers, which is consistent with what we're sort of seeing on the national level as it relates to border crossings. What we have also noticed, though, is for individuals who are ultimately arrested in Operation Lone Star, and then some who are deported, we're starting to see a little bit more of the chaos as to where they will be deported that is occurring. So just the other day, I was hearing from an attorney who represents a Cuban client. The Cuban client, male, and his wife, female, were both crossing together. They were both arrested under Operation Lone Star. They both posted bond. The wife was released to the U.S. The husband was deported to Mexico. And from being deported to Mexico, he was then flown by the Mexican government to Tabasco. So you have a Cuban client who was separated from his wife, who is now in southern Mexico, and it's sort of not very easy to communicate with him for obvious reasons, and so we're trying to figure out, like, where is he, what is going on. And meanwhile, his state criminal prosecution case continues. So we're starting to see examples of this, of like sort of the new deportation mechanism and the chaos that is going to ensue from it. To touch on the last question you'd asked, Hannah, as far as coverage goes, there has been a lot of coverage on Operation Lone Star. A lot of it is sporadic. I mean, now the program has been around for a long time, so there was a lot of press coverage in the very beginning, particularly because in the beginning, there were a ton of due process violations that were very blatant and shocking, shock the conscious type of stuff. And there was a lot of media coverage then. And then, of course, like all news cycles kind of change and things kind of calm down for a bit as far as press coverage goes. But one thing that continues to exist, and that I expect will continue to exist not just in Texas, but in other states that are replicating Operation Lone Star, which we're starting to hear whispers of, or not even whispers, we're starting to see legislation move towards it, is just the fact that the criminal justice system does not provide our clients with the kind of due process that I think the average American expects when it comes to criminal charges. And I think that's a really important aspect to cover, because I think a lot of times people have this assumption that, like, oh, well, the court, if it's in the courts, then things are going to happen kind of fairly. There's going to be some level of oversight. If someone pleads guilty, they are in fact guilty. And that's not at all the case, particularly in a system like Operation Lone Star, where the system is designed to result in coercive guilty pleas. The system is designed to prevent even people who are factually innocent, from going to trial. There are just a lot of due process violations in the system. So that is an area that I would love to see kind of more coverage on, is some of the ways that the court system fails these clients.
Thank you so much. Okay, we just heard, I think, an example of local state officials really walking in lockstep with federal officials. Tanya, you are in Chicago, and that is not really the case there. There's a lot of disagreement about what the role of local police in immigration enforcement should be. Can you talk a little bit about what the environment is like on the ground there right now, and sort of similar question, has the coverage that you've seen been getting it right? Are there things that you wish you saw more of, less of?
Right on. Yeah, so Chicago, I mean, we've been a sanctuary city for over 40 years. It was initially implemented by Mayor Harold Washington, although I think a lot of assumption is that our current mayor, Brandon Johnson, implemented, at least from the public's eyes, what I can tell is kind of the narrative here. And that is a result of the right-wing strategy, which has been intentionally to stoke division between marginalized communities. When the Texas Governor Greg Abbott made the decision to start busing thousands of migrants to sanctuary cities like Chicago, it was just one example of this kind of divide and conquer strategy. And we've seen it play out here, especially, obviously, I'm coming from the lens of the movement of what we call liberation, which is really just the belief that all people are actually created equal. But by doing so, you know, they have tried to place immigrant communities in opposition, not only to each other, like as the current undocumented population who've been living in the shadow here for decades, who've been promised reform from presidential candidates over and over again on both sides of the aisle, never has happened, with the new migrants coming from Venezuela, Ukraine, who had been given temporary protection. It's been causing this kind of rift between the immigrant community in general, but also, you know, with other marginalized communities. The Black community specifically here in Chicago, which is a big part of how this mayor was elected, who was a teacher, right? He's not like a kind of common politician, right? And so these groups, all these groups historically oppressed have been manipulated into viewing each other as threats rather than allies in common struggle. And so the immigrant community that has lived here, right, for decades, promised reform, is now caught in the middle of a zero-sum political game designed to just sow chaos and discord. And the media, specifically in Chicago, but I would say nationally, has played a significant role in amplifying these divisive tactics. The narrative that the mayor is failing by not doing enough in handling an unprecedented crisis only fuels this divide. And the media's hyper criticism of the mayor of Chicago, despite the unique challenges he faces, is another form of political weaponization. And so by focusing on perceived failures rather than the successes and progressive strides that have been made in the city, they drown out the efforts to protect vulnerable communities. And so the coverage often ignores the fact that the mayor is managing a very complex crisis, one that has never been seen before in Chicago's history, and instead focuses on the political games that harm the broader community. Chicago has been at the center of the movement for immigration reform for a very long time. In fact, my mother has been a leader in that. And so for us, it was no surprise that we were going to kind of be a focal point when the Trump administration took place, right? But what we need more of in the media is stories that bring people together, right? We need narratives that show the interconnectedness of struggles for racial justice, immigrant rights, and economic equality. And the media should highlight the collective efforts of communities, Black, Brown, and immigrant populations coming together in solidarity to resist these oppressive tactics. We need more human-centered stories that emphasize the power of community organizing, mutual aid. And we also need to see coverage that draws connections between the shared experiences, specifically of family separation. I think it's really easy to dehumanize communities, especially immigrant communities, when we just throw it on them like they're just an undocumented individual or they're just an immigrant. But these are families. And family separation is not just an issue of deportation, but also incarceration, also the loss of housing, the loss of healthcare, because these are not isolated issues, but are all a part of like a broader system of oppression that targets marginalized groups. We need less fear mongering. I think I've said that many times, but I think another part is what's particularly dangerous is that the rhetoric coming from this administration combined with these actions from the federal government and ICE has emboldened white supremacist groups. And this is not being covered. I think these groups that are actually dangerous are operating with way more confidence, feeling validated by a government that has given them that platform. And we've seen it firsthand, because my own church, my organization, which had long supported the undocumented community, was visited by Terry Newsom just a few weeks ago, a leader of the Proud Boys, who also, while he was here, met with Tom Homan, the former or the head of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So this is an appalling and dangerous alignment, and the head of immigration enforcement meeting openly with a known white supremacist leader. The Proud Boys have historically been violent and hateful, and the fact that such figures are meeting with law enforcement officials is not just troubling, it's a clear threat to public safety. And I think that needs to be covered as well. I mean, this guy came and harassed my 71-year-old mother, who's the pastor of our church. Basically saying that she was harboring illegals, also saying that our church was a fake church, and accusing us of teaching communism. And I think this is also kind of an attempt to reignite a new version of the Red Scare. This is not just about ideology, it's about the weaponization of words like communism and woke to dehumanize and vilify entire communities and movements. So I think this is something obviously we need to think about when we're pushing narratives and how we're contributing to these different things. And I'll just stop there, because I can run on and on about, just how the narrative in media has affected our literal movement here in Chicago that we have been working really hard on. I mean, just getting this mayor elected he was an underdog and nobody expected it to happen. It was totally a grassroots movement. And not just the mayor being villainized, but the Chicago Teachers Union, and all of this is being supported by the media right now.
Thank you so much, Tanya. There's two questions that I do want to get to, but just a quick little lightning round here. You mentioned the term family separation, and that was a really interesting reframe under Trump's first administration. To your point, family separation happens all the time, both through incarceration, immigration. It wasn't just some anomalous thing in Trump's first term. So I'm curious if any of you have other language shifts, but also language shifts that help us to actually do a narrative shift in how people think about these systems, that would help people understand these things more clearly. Thinking like moving away from terms like illegal alien, things like that.
I'm happy to get us started. I think one of the sort of dynamics that we see is that immigrants, right, are being, we've moved from like undocumented to illegal, and then illegal to criminal, right? So that there is a conflation, right, across the board. And that conflation, just sort of the label criminal, right, creates a permission structure to do any number of things. And so I think on the criminal justice side, on criminal justice reporting, right, there's been a lot of work done, still tons of work to do on using people first language, right? Avoiding saying criminals and saying people accused of crimes, formerly incarcerated people instead of convict, or somebody convicted of a felony rather than saying felon, making sure that we're using people first language in the criminal justice context. Because Forward has did a study, and study after study shows that when you use people first language, people take a different view of the policy issues, right? And when you use words like criminal, felon, convict, inmate, right, people have a negative view and they see that issue in a different way. So that work has been talked about on the criminal justice side. And one thing I think is super important is to import that view of people first language around criminal justice issues, around all issues, but really criminal justice issues, as it's being used in immigration coverage, right? Because often when folks are writing about immigration enforcement or reporting on something that a politician has said, they will say, targeting criminals. And it's sort of a throwaway line in a number of stories. But that framing does a number of things, right? It creates this permission structure that sort of lumps everybody together, right? And allows sort of more aggressive policy and action. It also, I think, as we were sort of talking about before, it really eliminates what are really important distinctions around due process, the presumption of innocence, right? Lots of people who are ending up in immigration enforcement, right, or in ICE custody, are being labeled as criminals when they have not been convicted of anything, right? And so when we just use the label criminals rather than saying people accused of crimes, people convicted of crimes, we lose a really important and critical policy distinction, right? In addition to creating this permission structure, this broader permission structure. So one hope that I think we would love to see is folks who are reporting on immigration being thoughtful about criminal justice phrasing and terminology and making sure that the people who are actually being caught up in these actions are being humanized, right? And that we are not just lumping people together under this term criminal, because it is misleading and I think ultimately really harmful.
I would just add to mixed status families and the word family. I think a lot of people just assume like these are individuals, but they're a part of families that actually have US citizen children, sometimes spouses, sometimes even elders. That, removing someone, who hasn't been convicted of any crime would affect the US citizens that are, left to either deal with, whatever financial burden comes from that. Also, obviously, we've been working with mixed status families, we call Familia Latina Unida, and there's been cases where an undocumented father is deported, but the rest of the family are US citizens, and the children end up, having suicide attempts, end up missing school. Like, these are obviously threats to the safety of US citizens. For people who care about citizens so much, I think it's important to kind of frame, these people as a part of families who have US citizens. And then also just throwing this out there, veterans get deported. I know some people don't know this, but we have been a part of trying to get deported veterans back. And it doesn't matter from where they're from, the majority of them get deported to Mexico. And these are people who fought even in the Vietnam War. These are elders. And so I think these are also ways to kind of frame the immigration issue in a way that, people would care a little bit more because they're either veterans or they're part of citizen families. But again, like kind of framing that they're part of families, I think is important.
I will add that it becomes particularly important to have a critical eye on this because the Trump administration right now is really aggressively fighting this fight. And they are literally taking every federal form in the immigration system and crossing out the word immigrant and reissuing that form with the word alien on it to make sure that people don't feel any kinship with those going through the immigration system. And it is absolutely, as Scott said, part of creating a permission structure to send those people to Guantanamo or to lock them up indefinitely on the basis of someone's say-so. And so when you have to cover what the government is doing and saying, you can still pull back from the language they're using and identify that that itself is a tactic and a really aggressive part of the Trump agenda for mass deportation and criminalization of immigrants.
Yeah, and I'll just give another example of what Lena just described, which is the term crisis. This idea of the border crisis was something that we heard from a lot of elected officials, and including, here in Texas. And that was the image that was being painted in a lot of people's minds as to what was happening at the border. Even in January, when Trump took office, there was still this like talk of border crisis. But if you actually went to the border, there was nothing, it was calm. There was no one entering. It was not at all what I think, the term crisis suggests. And actually what we see happening now is the crisis, right? The fact that we have people that are being separated from their families, that are being unjustly detained, all of that kind of stuff. And so I think it is really critical to recognize sort of the messaging that's coming out from different parties and different elected officials, and how adopting that terminology carries with it such deep implication and paints this image that may not actually be factually accurate. And so figuring out the right way to either attribute that terminology just to them, but to not actually report it as if it were fact, that's of course not in my field of work, but I think it's a very critical thing to think about as you're reporting.
Thank you all. Okay, I think I'm going to spend another 5-ish minutes, maybe just on this last question, and then we're going to get to the stuff in the Q&A. Just reminder, if you have any questions, throw them in there. This is for whoever wants to answer it. Are there financial incentives for local police to work with federal authorities on these things?
I can start and then other folks can weigh in. Much less than you might think. We have seen over the last few months, unsurprisingly, the Trump administration radically expanding the 287G program. And 287G refers to a provision of the statute, which is why it has that dumb name. But this is a program where local law enforcement can sign an agreement with ICE where they are given certain immigration enforcement powers. And generally, notwithstanding what we said about how local police drive all of immigration enforcement, that is true, but they don't technically have legal power to arrest someone purely for immigration violations. They have to arrest them for some kind of criminal charge and then feed them into the immigration system. That's the machinery, as Amrutha illustrated with Operation Lone Star, right? They do it trespassing, but it's all really about an immigration enforcement action. Anyway, 287G, they have expanded enormously, and we see a lot of different police departments and sheriffs, particularly around the country, signing up for this. There is no money associated with 287G. It's actually in the statute that it won't cost the federal government anything. And so that is purely local law enforcement agencies choosing to do the federal government's immigration enforcement job on their own dime. And that's why it has been sort of the hallmark of white supremacist sheriffs for quite some time. And in this climate, we've seen an increase in those agreements. In the detention space, it's a different picture. Sheriffs make money typically renting beds in their jails to ICE for immigration detention. But they don't, unless they have 287G, decide who goes into those beds. So ICE controls, right, who is in immigration detention once they've started their process. But absolutely, there is an incentive to rent jails to ICE. And even we see when communities are considering jail expansions and they have to take into account the costs, that is often justified by anticipating a contract with ICE or the U.S. Marshals to underlie the costs of constructing or expanding a local jail.
I will just add that, something that we've already touched on, though, which is the inverse, like financial incentive, which is the threat of taking away funding, right? Those are two sides of the same coin, right? And that is sort of being, funding and those types of incentives are being utilized on both sides of the equation, right? Both to break down what they may see as opposition or to facilitate what they see as cooperation.
And one last thing, because memories are so short. During the last Trump administration, they also defunded sanctuary cities and they lost about 25 different lawsuits over doing this, and yet they're doing it again. And so, yes, they're doing it again, but I do think a little historical context is relevant there, considering how we see the lawlessness of just doing something again when it's been shot down.
And just actually one last thing before we get to these other questions. This made me think of it. Where are people being held right now? I know that when the Laken Riley Act passed, I think ICE itself said, we are going to need tens of thousands more beds for this actually to be actionable. Are they going to federal prisons? Are they going, to what Amrutha described, these sort of tent cities? I know this is different across the country, but if you can give folks sort of some array of where people are being detained.
I mean, the clients that I'm aware of that have been detained right now have been detained in immigration detention centers. So part of the issue is when we talk about sort of the lack of bed space. It's that most of these centers are sort of full, and that's why it sometimes can feel sort of arbitrary as far as like who's detained and who's not. But we know that there are active plans to continue to expand these and create alternatives to these centers so that there are more beds available. And just in terms of like the practical reality, we've had clients who have been living in the United States for 2 years. Let's say their asylum hearing is scheduled for 2027, routinely checking in with ICE, and just at their ICE check-in, they get detained. They didn't commit any new crime, they didn't violate any condition of anything. It's just, all of a sudden they go to ICE and ICE says, guess what, today we're detaining you. That is real and that is happening. And I think the pace with which that could happen is going to increase as there are an expansion of detention beds in different facilities.
I think in terms of a national story, ICE is aggressively trying to expand its capacity to detain immigrants. And there's so much to say about how to cover immigration detention. The first of which is just that this is ostensibly a civil system. It's the only civil law system I know of where people get arrested and detained indefinitely. Immigration is by definition indefinite. It happens until the end of your immigration case. And if you fight your case because you have kids here, it lasts longer. And to the questions about Laken Riley in the beginning, Laken Riley expands mandatory detention. And if we are in the immigration system for a long time, we throw around this term mandatory detention like it makes any sense. But you should always step back and say, this means that you are detained in a prison throughout your immigration civil proceedings with no right to bail. In most states, the only way that someone is absolutely categorically ineligible for bail is if they're charged with like a capital offense or like some very, very narrow number of charges. But mandatory detention in immigration is incredibly broad, and now under Laken Riley applies to people merely accused of shoplifting. The other thing I want to mention about detention is ICE depends on the expansion of detention to radically increase mass deportations. And the Detention Watch Network is a great source of information for where and when they are expanding contracts and new facilities. Just in the last weeks, there's been announcements of new contracts in New Jersey, Ohio, Mississippi. Obviously, Guantanamo has been covered, but they're aggressively seeking more jails to detain more people.
Okay, I want to move to some questions. I'm just going to go from the bottom up here. Can you share any advice for local reporters with mainly local resources, how they can cover immigrant detentions when immigrants in our coverage areas are being moved to detention centers hundreds of miles or states away?
Um, it's a really tough situation. As this question illuminates, once someone is in ICE custody, they can be transferred to any ICE detention facility anywhere. If that person was originally detained locally or has local counsel, they will be trying to get in touch with their local immigration lawyer or at least their family from wherever they are sent to. And so those people would be the best conduit to talk to them. I mean, I would reach out to local immigration legal services and lawyers who might have contacts in far-flung facilities.
I would also just say that, folks don't exist in a vacuum, right? They have families, they have communities, they have people that they leave behind, right? And I think, going to what Tanya was saying, like understanding sort of those stories, those networks, those relationships is really critical, right? It is about what's happening to people as they move through an enforcement sort of machinery. It is also about who they left behind and what communities are doing to respond to that and how that impacts and affects people, right? Because this is a panel about sort of crime and criminal justice, right? But it's part of the conversation should really be about public safety, right? And how public safety is a more robust, more holistic sort of approach to these things, and extracting people from their communities, from their families, from schools, from neighborhoods, right, is deeply destabilizing. And if what we're doing is thinking about public safety, right, like we need to understand those stories as well. So I think those local stories are incredibly important, right? We talked about sort of language choices centering human beings, but I do think that that sort of we need to center human beings as stories too, right? It's not just using the word family separation, but showing what that means, right? And as Tanya also said, so many folks are in mixed status families, right? Like the destruction that gets left behind is just as much part of the story as anything else, I think.
Okay, another question. This is kind of going back to what Lena and Scott, you were talking about at the beginning with the expansion of these policies. Was there a specific event in the 90s that triggered these changes, is the question.
I'm happy to start. Other folks may have different sort of opinions on this. I mean, I'm not sure if there's a specific thing, right? But these bills that were passed, right, were not done in isolation, right? This is sort of the height of tough on crime, and expansion of state jail systems, federal prison systems, expansion of criminalization across the board, the rise in sentences across the board. One of the sort of interesting parts of what happened in the mid 90s is there was an immigration bill, IRIRA, which I always think is funny saying out loud. IRIRA, which really expanded criminalization within immigration law, but there was also EDPA, which is the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which expanded immigration categories as well, right? Some of this was done explicitly within the context of criminal justice bills. And that was done within the context of, much large, criminal justice policy and law being passed at the federal level, at the state level, and a real just reorientation, right, of our criminal justice system. And so, I think these things were just deeply put together in the mid 90s. So it wasn't that any one of these bills was a direct response to a single incident. It was really a movement, right, of criminalization that really moved not just into immigration law, but moved into our civil law, housing law, right? Criminal bars, criminal triggers, criminal everything sort of found its way into every part of our law, right? Your eligibility for any number of benefits or whatever became contingent on criminal justice contact or lack of criminal justice contact. So immigration, I think, is one of the starkest examples of this, but by no means was it the only, right? We saw this happen across the board, across all areas of law. So
Anyone else want to chime in with the 2 minutes we have left?
I totally agree with what Scott said, and I would just add that it was also very much an outgrowth of the war on drugs. And we see particularly even drugs singled out in the immigration law as like particularly bad consequences relative to certain other offenses.
All right. We are going to end exactly on time. Thank you all so much for coming today. I don't want to volunteer all these people's email addresses, but if you have more questions, follow-ups, feel free to send them to me, and I can direct them to our panelists. And yeah, thank you so much to the 4 of you for taking the time to share your expertise with us today. We really appreciate it. All right. Take care, everyone.